Okay, welcome everyone to this continuing series on essential nectar. Let's go ahead and start, as we usually do, with a few prayers. Again, we'll just do this recitation of this praise to Shakyamuni Buddha one time rather than three. But as we do this, we can think about last week we did talk about the refuge and the three jewels. And of course, our refuge, the ultimate refuge, the final refuge really is the Buddha jewel. And the Buddha is possessing of all these qualities that we're talking about, the ability to help us and all beings and so on. So as we recite this, just bring to mind Buddha Shakyamuni in particular, but all the Buddhas, and develop a sense of homage to them, but also some sense of refuge in them. So, to the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we'll do the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then finally, refuge in bodhicitta, first time in English, then twice chanting the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chenyen Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Dupam Shom Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyan Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupal Shom. And then, as usual, we'll also do a short meditation before we begin. Give ourselves a chance to come into this space and focus our minds, as well as set our motivation. So spend the first few minutes meditating on the breath, whatever way you prefer. And then I will come in and lead you in setting motivation. So we can begin now. So, to set our motivation for tonight, let's think about the topic of refuge that we began last week. Having examined the foundational teachings of us having this perfect human rebirth and having met with the Dharma through the kindness of our gurus, and then the fact that this life will come to an end and that there is the possibility, due to the preponderance of non-virtue that we've created, that we could end up in an unfortunate state. So refuge is the answer to that, the beginning of the answer to that. To see that there are objects that we can place our confidence in to protect us from that fear as well as all the other fears of samsara. When we take refuge, we generally do talk about this external refuge, the three jewels that are outside of ourselves, the causal refuge, the beings, Buddhas, and members of the Sangha, the advanced practitioners, as well as the Dharma, the teachings, these things that we look to that are outside of ourselves and that can help us. But we also talk about internal refuge, resultant refuge, the idea that we are also taking refuge in our own future enlightenment. Every one of us has the potential to achieve that state. And we're going to think about the fact that we can join the ranks of the Buddhas then. We can become a source of refuge for others. And we're going to take refuge in that potential, that possibility, even that reality, where we each will attain enlightenment at some point in the future. And in a way, this is setting our bodhicitta motivation, thinking that we are here taking refuge in our own future enlightenment as the answer to the world's problems, the answer to the suffering that we see in this world and in all states of existence. So bring those two ideas together of refuge and bodhicitta, refuge in your own future enlightenment, and the bodhicitta that encompasses that along with the wish to benefit all sentient beings. And this is our motivation for engaging in these teachings tonight. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. So as I said, we did start the topic of refuge last week. We went through a few of the verses that pertain to that. Again, let me get you oriented in terms of the slides that I've prepared for tonight. So these are the slides I went through at the end of last week after we talked about the lower rebirths, the hell realms, the realms of the pretas, and then the animal realms. So we're in the section still pertaining to the path of the inferior person, as Rinpoche would say, the least capable being or small capable being. So this encompassed four main teachings that are divided into two groups. First, to generate that attitude of concern for future lives, which is the first level of kind of motivation that we bring in our Lamrim teachings, is wanting to avoid unfortunate states and to create the causes for more fortunate existences in the future. And the second part of this, relying on the means to gain happiness in future lives, given that that is our motivation, that we want to attain good rebirths. Well, how do we do that? Again, the main or a good part of it is taking refuge in the three jewels. And that's the section that we're on. And then we'll go on tonight to talk about the second part, developing conviction in karma, the law of cause and effect. So we did go through the first three points here, the causes of taking refuge, the objects of refuge, and the manner of going for refuge. And maybe to review those, I'll go through the verses very quickly on those. Then we'll take a look tonight at the practices after having taken refuge, which are essentially what we often call the 12 refuge commitments. And I even have a little handout on those that I'm going to pass along to Colleen to provide to you. And then the benefits of taking refuge, which are contemplated as part of that. So before I leave the slides, I'm just going to mention that when we get to that new section, the practices having taken refuge, it is there's an introductory verse, and then we will have the what are often called the individual practices, meaning that for each of the three jewels, we have two practices, something to do and something to avoid. And so we'll talk about those in regard to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Those are the first six. And then we have the more common practices that pertain to all three jewels. And those are another six commitments, making our total of 12 commitments. So let's go ahead and return to our text, Essential Nectar. Again, we're in this meditation number 5, the practice of taking refuge. And we read these verses last time, but again, just to review, I'll go through them quickly. Thus, the unbearable sufferings of the hells, of pretas, and of beasts are hard to endure. Whoever else I go to for refuge, except the three jewels, the three supreme ones, cannot protect me from them. We cannot find another refuge that will be reliable in protecting us. How can I be protected by the three jewels? The Dharma is the actual refuge which saves from these fears. The Buddha are the teachers of this Dharma. The Sangha, my helpers in the Dharma's practice. So the actual refuge that we have to look to are the teachings. Again, these are said to be like the medicine. But the ultimate refuge really is the Buddha, the doctor, who gives us those teachings. Because that's the final goal. That's what we're all aiming for and will eventually attain. Then the Sangha are like the helpers, the assistants who help us to take the medicine of the Dharma. So again, the two causes of refuge were mentioned in verse 239. Some level of fear here, fear of the lower realms, but we see that there's always some level of trepidation or fear that we have throughout the Lamrim. So our refuge changes and develops as we go through each of the scopes, each of the three levels of the Lamrim. And then the other cause is, having confidence that the three jewels can protect us from those fears. So then the manner of taking refuge says, if therefore I do not rely from my heart on the threefold infallible supreme refuge as my protector, I have no means of freedom from special and general fears, of ill destinies, dreadful abyss, and of samsara. So again, we can see that it starts off with the fears of the ill destinies, these states of existence, the realms of woe that we want to avoid. But it can also become a fear of samsara and a fear of any being in samsara. And when we get to the Mahayana level, again, we'll try to relate that back to refuge as we go through that. So then this assertion of taking refuge from this moment, moreover, I must strive to keep this refuge. If I fall to a realm of woe, then wailing and calling out hundreds of cries for help, I'll still find no protector there at all. Again, it's not to say that the Buddhas can't exist in those places. It's just that it's very hard for them to do anything for beings in that realm due to the extreme conditions. So this is the actual verse of refuge. Therefore, from now on, I and all other migrators go to the Buddhas, the supreme teachers, for refuge. We go to their teachings, the holy Dharma, for refuge. We go to the Sangha who practice it for refuge. So again, you could recite that as your refuge verse 3 times, 7 times, whatever you prefer. Um, Again, we do have other refuge formulas, but this is the essence of any of these refuge verses, is to take refuge in those three jewels quite specifically. I might add, we did talk about the topic of relating to the guru very early on in this text. Sometimes we even have a fourth object of refuge that we include in the prayers, which is taking refuge in the gurus. Because once more, the gurus are the embodiment of the three jewels for us, as we discussed when we went through that topic. So they are the Buddha jewel. We try to see them through that lens as much as possible, especially when we get to the tantric teachings. Again, it's not essential prior to that, but the whole Lam Rim is geared to eventually take us all the way to the tantric teachings. So kind of starts with that type of practice, with seeing our gurus as Buddhas. When you get to Tantra, it's required that you see whoever your tantric master is as a Buddha, because that's part of tantric empowerment, tantric initiation. But essentially, we can see some verses where they say, even in the Lama Chopa, the Guru Puja that is done at centers frequently, it's Namo Guru Bhye, Nama Buddhaya, Nama Dharmaya, Nama Sanghaya. And so the idea is you're always going to refuge to all four of those in essence. And it starts with the Guru, because the Guru is the object for us that's in our lives and that we have the strongest relationship to. So they are the Buddha, they are the Dharma, kind of in the realizations they have in their minds, and they are the Sangha, the spiritual assistants that can help us on our path. So I just wanted to point that out that I didn't mention that last week, but essentially this verse only includes the three jewels, but we are occasionally using the gurus as a fourth object of refuge. But again, usually putting it first rather than fourth because the guru is the most important object in our lives. So now we move into the section pertaining to the commitments, and we first get the introductory verse, which is just 2 lines here. Having thus vowed refuge in the three jewels, I must train correctly in the refuge practices. So I'll just go to the sheet here that I again will provide to Colleen, the 12 refuge commitments. These are based on, I think, a lot of the wording that Venerable Chodron uses. I just like the way that she put these together. So what we're going to see is we're going to see once more the 6 individual guidelines, meaning they pertain to each of the three jewels. We have one that we, don't do, that we avoid, and one that we do. You have an affirmative. One is proscriptive, the other is prescriptive, and I'm never quite remembering which is which. But anyway, the idea is that we avoid one and we do the other. So these are again on this sheet that I'll provide. And then we have the 6 common guidelines, 6 things that pertain to all three jewels together. So anyway, I just thought I would point that out. We'll pass that along. Maybe I'll go to that here and there, but I don't know that I will. Probably just go through and explain them on the basis of what's in our text, which is actually quite nice. So first, verse 245 pertains to the Buddha jewel, the first of the three jewels that has individual vows or commitments. And these aren't technically vows, they are commitments. They have a strong power to them, but they're not a formal vow that we take. So, having taken the Master as refuge, I cannot take refuge in other teachers or worldly gods. This is the first one, is what we avoid. So it means that having put your final refuge in the Buddha, you don't go to other holy beings or whatever as your final refuge. Does it mean that you can't use the teachings of Christ or the teachings of some other great teacher as a, something you practice? Well, a lot of teachings are in line with what Buddhism teaches. This just means that your final refuge object is the Buddha. That's really what you look to in terms of being the bottom line. And so that's the idea behind it. We don't want to confuse things and what have you. But a lot of things, I mean, I grew up Catholic, and looking at a number of the teachings that Christ gave, they're very similar to things that the Buddha taught as well. Love your enemy, pretty profound teaching, right? And that's also what the Buddha taught, abandoning hatred towards anyone, towards any being, what have you. So this is what that one means, is essentially just to avoid any final refuge in regard to other objects. The last 2 lines of verse 245 are what we actually practice. With conviction, avoiding disrespect, I must worship even the Master's image as the Buddha. Again, worship is kind of a loaded word in our culture, but the idea is that you try to see any image of the Buddha, even a child drawing a Buddha figure or whatever, as the Buddha. And this means that we don't get too critical of how things look. I think that the general advice is given that if we're out looking for statues or a Tanka painting of the Buddha, or any Buddha, any enlightened being, that we don't get into, oh, this one's good, this one's bad. We might say, oh, the artist didn't quite have all the skill that that this artist has, or whatever. Try to keep it away from being a reflection on the actual Buddha, because a Buddha is a perfect being. So any depiction of a Buddha is a sacred object from that perspective. This is just about conditioning our minds to have that reverence and uh, and a feeling of great regard for any image of the Buddha that we see. We're going to see that that's going to be similar with regard to the Dharma in terms of how we look upon the Dharma with great respect. So, verse 246, having gone to the Dharma for refuge, I must stop adhering to non Dharma actions and thoughts to harm sentient beings. This is pointing to the fundamental teaching that the Buddha gave, that I think is also existent in other Asian cultures, of what is called in Sanskrit ahimsa. Ahimsa is non harmfulness. Everything that the Buddha taught is rooted in non harmfulness. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says, try to help others as much as you can, but if you can't help them, at least don't harm them. And this is what the Buddha's teachings come down to, is not doing anything that harms others as much as possible. Now, does that mean that we can't that there's no harm that can be caused by us being in the world. Well, that's impossible. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would often teach on this, that it's completely impossible to be in the world, to live as a sentient being and not be complicit in some harm that happens to others, right? Because even if you're vegan, well, you're still working with plants that are grown, that insects are killed to, farm them, to even ship them from one place to another. I mean, there are beings whose lives are lost just in the process of us getting good veggies. So that's not to be expected, that we can completely be detached from any harm to others. But we don't want to intentionally harm others. That's the big differentiation here. Again, it's good to be not so complicit in more other harmful acts with others if you can, but we each have to kind of work with that. His Holiness the Dalai Lama eats meat, and meat can certainly be seen as a product of harm to sentient beings. But again, he found it was necessary for his health. I'm not saying we should all go out and eat meat, but if we can adjust our lives to be not as complicit in some of this more indirect harm, I think it's a wonderful thing. But the biggest thing is to stop harming other beings directly, intentionally, because that's something we do have more control over, hopefully. The thing that we actually do in regard to the Dharma jewel is, it says, even to letters of the holy doctrine, I must be respectful, avoiding stepping over them. My teacher in Italy even said that, any letters, but I think it's really hard. Like when you look at our culture and we have like newspapers and all kinds of paper and everything. In the days of the Buddha, there weren't all these written materials, right? There wasn't a printing press and there wasn't all this stuff to produce, newspapers and all the other things that we have. It doesn't mean that we have to look at any piece of paper or letter and then avoid any sort of disrespect to it. We're primarily looking at the written teachings of the Buddha, the texts that we have, and so on, everything that we study that's Dharma. They say it's best to elevate those in your home on a shelf that is dedicated to them, as opposed to putting trashy novels up there with your, Lam Rim texts or something like that. And that's just, again, a mental thing, which it's not like the Buddhas are going to punish us for not having our books in the right order. It's the idea that we want to be holding those to be very precious, as something that we try to elevate to a higher degree and relegate the more mundane materials to a lower degree. But if you do have materials, Dharma materials that you're trying to get rid of, that you need to get rid of due to space or whatever, that you don't need any longer, certainly it's good to burn those rather than just throw them in the trash can. I have heard Venerable Children say that it's good to recycle when you can. Um, Anytime that you are doing anything where you're discarding of Dharma materials, so try to visualize that as you send it out to recycle bin or to the, burning it or whatever, that beings are receiving the benefit of it. You can even recite Doma Hong like you're offering the Dharma to others while you're doing that. But anyway, I won't go into all the detailed things on each of these commitments, but in some of them, I think it's good to just re-emphasize some of this protocol we have, which again is about training our minds to have respect for images of the Buddha, for the Dharma itself, and then of course for what represents the Sangha, which are essentially the monks and nuns that we see frequently in our communities. So, having taken the Sangha as refuge, I may not rely on companions with wrong views, such as Tritikas. Tritikas are often translated as like the outsiders, those who are outside the Buddhist fold. So we want to try to keep our friendships strong with people who practice the Dharma, but it doesn't mean you can't associate with people who aren't Buddhists. Just be careful because they might, have views that are very strongly opposed to what Buddhism teaches. And it's important that we don't let ourselves be swayed by them. And then, not attached or angry, I must revere those who wear even signs of saffron as actual Arya Sangha. Not in all the Buddhist traditions do they wear saffron robes, but at the time of the Buddha, that's what they wore. In the Tibetan monastic tradition, it's burgundy and saffron, a little bit of gold on the um, garments and everything. But it's whoever is wearing the robes is an ordained being, someone who has taken the pratimoksha vows for ordination. And so we want to respect them in the same way that we would respect actual Sangha. Remember, the actual Sangha are those beings who have developed a direct realization of emptiness. We usually refer to them as Arya beings. Arya is translated sometimes as superior. They're superior in their knowledge. And we don't know who has those direct realizations of emptiness, right? It could be anybody, and beings that we think have them, who knows if they have them or not. They usually don't talk about it. So this is why, again, we just try to respect all beings as best as we can, but particularly we look upon those with wearing the robes through some level of respect and what have you. So those are the six that pertain to each of the individual jewels. Let's go on to talk about the ones that are relating to all three. So here it says, knowing how Buddhist and non-Buddhists differ, I must take refuge again and again in the three supreme ones. So it's kind of like reaffirming your affirmation of Buddhist kind of doctrine and what you want to follow in terms of Buddhism. You are meant to take refuge when you can, whenever you can. I think the way that it's worded on here, let me go back to Venerable Chodron's little list. It says, mindful of the qualities, skills, and differences between the three jewels and other possible refuges, repeatedly take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So repeatedly, like as much as you can, try to take refuge. And by refuge, I don't know if I mentioned this last week. I think I did. Yeah, Lama Yeshe used to say, apparently, according to Venerable Connie Miller, that he didn't like taking refuge. He would say doing refuge. That's what we mean by that first commitment, is like you do refuge. Like when something happens, somebody accosts you here or there or whatever, you take refuge in the three jewels. You go back to a place of non-harmfulness, not responding with anger as best as you can, trying to subdue your mind, all these sorts of things. This is what it means to do refuge. And otherwise, if we're just kind of giving lip service to it and saying, oh, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Buddhist, but we never do what the Buddha is encouraging us to do, again, for our own benefit as well as the benefit of others, then how are we really Buddhist? Are we really um, following what the Buddha's refuge is all about? So then the second one, remembering their kindness, I'll always strive in their worship, offering them the first part of my food and drink. So when we sit down to eat anything, a meal or a snack or whatever, we try to think about the three jewels and offering it to them first. Doesn't mean you actually take it and put it on your altar and give it to them. It means you just think about them receiving it, and any happiness you experience from that food, you can offer that to them and to all beings as well. But we want to think of the three jewels first. That's the second one. Recollecting compassion, I'll also establish other migrators in taking of refuge in the three jewels. This doesn't mean that we go proselytizing door to door, trying to encourage people to, take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, leaving materials for them or whatever to read. But it means that we try to be an example of that in the world, so that we encourage others just by how we are in the world, that we aren't going to retaliate against others. We aren't going to say things and do things that upset others. And then, people learn from that and they hopefully get some appreciation for what it means to be Buddhist. If there are teachings we can share, by all means, we should do that. But I think it's always best. I mean, my own kind of thing is that if I do have somebody who's non-Buddhist, I try not to just, shove Buddhist teachings down their throat, because that's always something that people have a strong reaction to, right? Well, I'm not Buddhist. Why are you telling this to me? Always ask for permission. Like say, well, I'd really like to help you because I see you're going through a difficult time, some pain, what have you. I have some teachings I'd like to share with you, but it's up to you. Would you like that or not? And then let people decide for themselves. And Buddhism has always played that kind of a role, not really like pushing anything on anybody, because if people have the karma for Buddhism, they will find it and find the usefulness of it. And so if we can always offer, if we feel comfortable with that situation. You wouldn't go up to a stranger and probably offer them teachings on Buddhism, but if there are people in our circle of friends, family, what have you, I think it's perfectly fine to do that, but to do it in that method, that way. Then it says, I'll avoid other methods apart from revering the threefold refuge on every occasion and making requests. So the idea here is that particularly when we have difficult situations going on in our lives, that we go to the three jewels first. We think of them and what the advice is that they want us to follow in regard to that particular situation. This is why, again, we can include our gurus often in refuge, because they are often the ones that we go to in difficulty to try to, get the advice that they have to offer. But as much as possible, we want to, again, do refuge in that way as well. Then the fifth one of these six that pertain to all three jewels, knowing the benefits, I must go for refuge 3 times each day and 3 times every night. So again, we can do that using the verse that was up in 243. Um, you can use that. There is a standard version of the one we do before the teachings that isn't by listening to the Dharma. It says instead by the practice of giving and other perfections. I think many of you have that in some materials that you own. You can recite that again 3 times in the morning, 3 times in the evening. If you're doing a practice, you're always generally reciting the refuge verse. But know that just reciting the refuge verse doesn't mean you're really taking refuge. It just means you're reciting words. There has to be some thought behind it. And we really have to think about what those words mean. I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Supreme Assembly until I attain enlightenment. That's pretty powerful words. It's really like setting this intention for from here until the end of the line when I achieve Buddhahood. That's who I turn to. That's where my refuge is. So while saying it is fulfilling the requirement, it should be more than just the words, and it should be a lot of very powerful thoughts of confidence and faith in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then finally, by going for refuge, I'm sorry, I may not give up the three refuges even in jest, nor for my life, but must keep them on my crown. So the idea here is that we try not to lose our sense of refuge. Now, again, it says at the risk of your life. I mean, I hopefully none of us are ever at a point where we're being threatened, disavow your refuge in the three jewels, or I will kill you, or something. I don't think that's going to happen necessarily in our lives, but this just means that we really should keep our refuge very strong, so that if we were in such a situation, we would never disavow our refuge, because we have that level of confidence in it. Lama Tsongkhapa says that the only way you lose your refuge in the three jewels is actually that commitment. If you break that, if you go against that, and you don't have that level of faith and confidence to where you would turn away from Buddha's teachings and what have you. That's why it is important that we think very strongly about refuge before we make a determination to do it. I think I mentioned last week that you can do it through a formal ceremony with a refuge preceptor. Somebody like Geshe Sherab or Venerable Chodron, I'm sure they all, will act as refuge preceptor if you invite them to come there and do that, or if you have the opportunity to do that with them online. But the idea is that we also can take refuge on our own by coming to this determination ourselves, that that's the bottom line for us. That is where we see real refuge, real protection. And that's, again, a personal decision that you make. It's not something that anyone else can kind of question. But essentially, once you have done that, either mentally on your own side or through ceremony, then these are the 12 that you should follow. These are the 12 things that you should abide by every day of your life, from here till enlightenment. Again, I think technically the refuge vows or the refuge commitments are given with the idea of this life. But because we're practicing Mahayana and the intention to become enlightened, we want to hold them with that spirit, that this is something that we want to guide us from lifetime to lifetime, as many lifetimes as it takes to attain enlightenment. I'm going to go through rather quickly the last two verses that pertain to the benefits of taking refuge. These are to be contemplated in regard to, I think it was, which one that it said, let me go back to the uh, sheet that Venerable Chodron has, because it indicates there by remembering the benefits right there, number 4, remembering the benefits of taking refuge, do so 3 times in the morning, 3 times in the evening, and so on. So remembering the benefits, well, what are the benefits of refuge? Okay, so verse 251. By going for refuge, establishing this in your mind, you enter the door of the doctrine. This is how you actually become Buddhist in terms of your conduct. Of course, there's other ways we strengthen ourselves as Buddhists through philosophy, philosophical tenets, and what have you. But the main way you do through your conduct is taking refuge. So you actually become Buddhists by virtue of that. Secondly, it acts as a basis for growth of the 3 pure vows. You have to have refuge before you take pratimoksha vows, individual liberation vows. either the 5 lay vows or any of those, or the monks and nuns vows, as well as the second level of vows, the bodhisattva vows, and the third tantric vows. So refuge is a basis for all 3 of those. Number 3, it curbs or exhausts your bad karmas. Of course, that means if you're doing refuge, if you are actually um, kind of engaging in following the Buddha's teachings, well, it curbs your bad karmas. Taking refuge itself does exhaust them to some degree, but don't think just taking refuge in and of itself is going to completely remove all of our negative karma. It's not that powerful. We have to do a lot more work, purification, and what have you, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Number 4, you gain vast merits. They say that the merit of taking refuge is very, very powerful. Number 5, one can't fall to the realms of woe. Of course, if you're doing refuge again, if you're continuing to abide by uh, the, the Buddha's advice of avoiding the non-virtuous actions that harm yourself and others. And then number 6, spirits can't harm you. This is said to be one of the powers of refuge, is that we don't have these kind of malevolent forces that you would have to create the karma to be harmed by. But essentially, if we aren't creating that karma and we are kind of seeing ourselves under the protection of the 3 jewels, then these sorts of spirits or other malevolent forces can't really harm you. Then number 7, one achieves what one wishes. And number 8, quickly becomes enlightened. So we see this is the means to actually attain our temporal goals of a good rebirth, as well as liberation and enlightenment, those that are more certain forms of goodness. So this is, again, just speaking to all the benefits of actually engaging in the mind of refuge, either again through ceremony or through on our own, coming to that conclusion. So the last 3 lines, as it's taught to bring such inconceivable benefits, I must maintain my refuge from my heart, not transgressing any of the practices. So this is, again, a pretty important topic. It's as I said, something that continues throughout the Lam Rim. We don't talk about refuge again in those sorts of terms when we get to the middle scope and the great scope, but our refuge carries on all the way again to Buddhahood, all the way to attaining the goal that we are ultimately set upon, our own becoming a Buddha jewel for the sake of others, teaching them the Dharma and helping them on their path, which again is what I mentioned in the meditation tonight, what we often call kind of taking refuge in our own inner ability to attain that. It's kind of a very powerful way of strengthening our bodhicitta. And of course, all of this is founded on the concept of Buddha nature. That every single being who possesses a mind, which is the Tibetan for sentient being, it's Sem Chen. Sem means mind and Chen means possess. So it's a mind possessor. Every being that possesses a mind, which are all sentient beings, has the potential to attain Buddhahood. Now, again, in any particular existence, they might not have the causes and conditions to work on that, but we, in this human existence we have now, do have that. And we have the ability to actually move in the direction of Buddhahood. It's because we do possess Buddha nature, which is essentially referring to our minds being fundamentally pure. Everything that contaminates our mind, it's not in the nature of our mind. It forms within our minds, but it's not the actual nature. Anger, ignorance, greed, all these things are not in the nature of your mind. Our minds are fundamentally pure. So again, there's many other things I could say about refuge, but it's rooted once more in the main causes of looking at some level of fear, apprehension about some suffering we or others have to experience, and then seeing that the 3 jewels are the means to attain freedom from all of that. So I think, again, requires a deep investigation of the Dharma before we really commit ourselves to taking refuge. But when you feel ready, and when you feel that that's, and maybe many of you have already done that in a formal way, it's very good to, acknowledge that. And I do think the formal ceremonies are helpful because they're a way of asserting that in community. And I think that's very strong. You might know that when you take refuge in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the refuge preceptor often gives you a refuge name that are the first of the names that the preceptor has. So I think it's like Venerable Rabina is Tupten Kunsuk. No, Tupten, not Kunsuk. I can't remember the last part. Anyway, so anybody who she gives refuge to would have Tupten as the first part of their name, and then she chooses names as a method for doing that. So anyway, it's kind of a cute thing that people do, and I think it's kind of nice to get a refuge name in that way. I remember when I first took refuge with Sogyal Rinpoche in 1993. It was in a retreat where there were hundreds of people, and he did it as a huge like group ceremony. And then he just said, and I want you to just your refuge name is just Pema, which is the Tibetan for lotus. Just put Pema in between your first and last name. And I was kind of disappointed with that. So I ended up taking refuge again with another Nyingma master, Penner Rinpoche. And Penner Rinpoche gave me my refuge name that is kind of, again, a more formal name, but just my own hang up, I guess. So that's refuge. We'll have time for questions towards the end. I want to move into the next topic because it's quite a big one, even though in terms of the verses, it has, I think, the least verses of all of these topics. And it's kind of strange because karma is a huge section of the Lam Rim. And when Geshe Sopa taught on the Lam Rim Chenmo, some of you may have the volumes that he's done. There's like 5 volumes of steps on the path to enlightenment. It's volume 2 that is like a good chunk of it is on karma, and it's a pretty big book. Karma is a huge topic and a very important topic because once more, karma is the methodology by which we create our experiences. So karma is the principle that guides all of the results that we're trying to attain. At the first level here, the good rebirths that we want to have. It is karma that dictates what rebirth you get, as well as many of the other conditions and experiences you have in those rebirths. Well, pretty much all of them that you have. But anyway, the idea is that karma also plays a role at the level of the middle scope. It's the way that you attain liberation, is creating the karma for you to actually accomplish that state. And of course, the same goes for Buddhahood with regard to the great scope. So karma is really, and I agree with Venerable, I think it's Thupten Dundrup. He's an Australian monk, and I think he teaches one of the teachings in the karma module, those little videos they put together for discovering Buddhism. And he says, in his estimation, karma is one of the most important teachings of the Buddha, if not the most important. You might think, oh, bodhicitta is important or emptiness is important. They're all important. But really, karma is the whole principle of things depending upon causes and conditions. The word karma literally means action. So we're primarily talking about the cause, the action we engage in that plants a seed of sorts. It's not a seed we can look at and analyze. It's a mental imprint that happens on the basis of the actions we do through our body, speech, or mind. But our body and our speech are usually following our minds. So if we do something physically or verbally on the basis of thoughts, it's primarily our thoughts that are creating it, but there's a compounding effect in a sense when we also have our speech and our physical actions engaged in things. But it's essentially the causes that we imprint on the mind that eventually ripen into results. So this is the whole thing we're going to be looking at in this, and I'll go through a couple of additional teachings after we go through the verses, because there's so much more to share on karma, but I don't obviously want to dwell on it too much because we have a lot of other things to go through. As we're leaving refuge, though, let's just do a couple of slides here of Lama Zopa talking about it. Whatever we do that protects our mind is dharma, and that in essence is taking refuge. Whether or not we call ourselves Buddhist, whether or not we have taken formal refuge, when we cut through our confusion by meditating on impermanence and death, like we did in that module or that meditation 3, wasn't it, where we looked at impermanence and death, we're taking refuge. That's what taking refuge means, is to meditate on impermanence and death. When we lessen our attachment by meditating on its shortcomings and on the problems brought by the 8 worldly dharmas, again, these ways that we get wrapped up in worldly concern, we are taking refuge. Developing compassion and loving kindness, moving the mind toward the altruistic attitude of bodhicitta is taking refuge. He's just emphasizing again, we're taking refuge throughout the entire Lam Rim. Studying and meditating on emptiness, how the self and all phenomena are empty of inherent existence, is taking refuge. So that's very much in line with that quote from Lama Yeshe, right? Of doing refuge. Doing refuge means doing the Dharma, doing these teachings by meditating on them, practicing them in your daily life. So verses 253 to 264, developing conviction and karma. Karma, again, can often refer to, in a more general sense, the law of cause and effect. But as I pointed out, it's technically the cause, the action that we do. So we have two verses of introduction, and then we're going to go on to discuss one topic that's presented in the Lam teachings on karma, the four general characteristics of karma. And then there's a conclusion, but then I'm going to add on, like I said, a number of other topics. Because there's just so much to talk about karma, and it is so important. I want to be able to at least give a few teachings, and you'll need to perhaps follow up with additional readings if you want to know more. Verse 253. If I fear those sufferings of the realms of woe, I must examine my own three doors and train with steady watchfulness, mindfulness, and awareness in the slightest approach to white and retreat from black actions, the approach to the white actions and the retreat from the black actions. This is the essence of practicing the law of cause and effect, karma, is to move towards those actions that lead us to happiness and retreat from, avoid the actions which lead us to suffering. This is what, having taken refuge, this is what it means to practice refuge at this level of the stages of the path, is to gain this conviction in the way karma works and our desire to follow the law of karma. Those unbearable sufferings are only results of actions I have accumulated myself. But since no one else has made me undergo them, I must strive now to leave non-virtue and practice virtue. I might just point out one thing. Venerable Rabina often emphasizes this: is that when we start hearing teachings on karma, we're conditioned by perhaps more theistic traditions to think it's punishment. When you have something unfavorable coming about due to your unskillful actions, or it's a reward if based on the good things you do, you get some good results in your life. It's not a system of reward and punishment. It's a simple system of cause and effect. I often, when I teach on karma, I talk about the confidence we have in the law of cause and effect in terms of the physical world. Here we are, we're entering into the warmer months of the year. Some of you perhaps want to grow a vegetable garden. Well, you know that you don't look out at your plot of land that you have, your little garden or whatever, and look out at the dirt every day and go, I don't know why my vegetables aren't coming up. I don't know why my vegetables are, and you never did anything, right? You have to go out there and you have to, clear the soil, make sure that the rocks and weeds and things are removed, make sure that there are enough nutrients in it, that it's moist enough. You plant the seeds or the, small plants. You make sure that they get enough water and sun, and you tend to them every day, and you'll get your vegetables at the end of the summer. Of course, if the bugs don't eat them, this is a common problem, right? But the idea is that we know that we have to create the causes for things in our physical world. We don't have any confusion about that. If you want to get a paycheck, you have to go to work every day. You have to do something, to be able to bring in the resources that you need to make sure there's money in your account so you can pay your bills and da 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 da. You don't think it's going to just come from nowhere. Well, this is a subset of the law of cause and effect, but it pertains specifically to the experiences of beings. Everything you experience is a product of past karma. So when you have something delightful happen, that's because of good seeds you planted in the past that have ripened in that moment due to conditions coming together for that to occur. And then when you have something negative happening, some form of suffering or pain, that's due to some non-virtuous karma that was planted, that the conditions have come forward for that, and it's ripened into that experience. So we are the creators of that. It's not someone else that's punishing us or rewarding us. We're the creators of that. And I know some people, when they hear this, they think, oh, well, I must have been a really lousy person based on all the suffering I'm going through or difficulties I'm having. That's not the right attitude either. Guilt shouldn't play a role in it at all. We're just looking at it as taking responsibility. Okay, I created it. So now I have to learn from it And this is the way Pema Chodron often frames it, is that karma is life giving you the lessons you need to learn. Well, if your life has a lot of people distrusting you or a lot of people really, loving you and caring for you, well, you've created both of those situations. And you need to examine, well, how did I create them? How did I create the problem of people distrusting me? Through my own distrust of others and my being dishonest with them and so on. I need to be meticulous in making sure that I have good integrity with others. And then if you see, oh, people care for me and they do things for me, well, that's a product of your own having been attentive to the needs of others and made sure that you're very careful with them. Well, then you need to keep doing that. So anything we experience can be analyzed in this type of way to see what it is that we need to kind of emphasize in our lives or de-emphasize if it's something that's causing us pain and difficulty. So it's a very wonderful kind of mirror to us. Everything happening in your life, if you see it through the lens of karma, is an incredible lesson. So that's the way I like to frame teachings on karma. And they're really just the Buddha's explanation. It's not the Buddha created karma. Buddha didn't create karma. The Buddha's just observing and saying, guess what, folks? You're the creator of your own pain, your own happiness. Mm. Take take charge. When I first started teaching on karma, I had this phrase I used, which was the teachings on karma are to help you to get out of the back seat and get into the driver's seat so you can actually go where you want to go. But then I realized that we were always in the driver's seat. We just didn't know the rules of the road because we are always creating karma. And we're just making bad decisions. We're driving really lousy sometimes and causing all kinds of pain and difficulty for ourselves and others. And sometimes we're a little more skillful in how we drive, but we need to learn the rules of the road. The entire teachings on karma are to do that. So the very first set of teachings are these four general characteristics, which have a lot of meat to them when we examine them. And let's take a look at them in regard to the slide first, and then I'll go through the individual verses. We're going to have first two verses that pertain to the first one, how karma is definite or certain, meaning that it's certain that if you create a non-virtuous action, you experience suffering. If you create a virtuous action, you experience happiness. Secondly, the great increase of karma. A small action, negative or positive, can create immense results because karma naturally, by its own power, increases over time. The third one does not meet karma one has not created, meaning that if you don't create the causes, you won't get the results, good or bad. And then lastly, if you do create the karma, then it's inevitable to have its result. And there are some conditions on that I'll talk about later, because we can attend to the negative actions we've created through purification. And we have to be careful that we don't destroy any of our positive actions through mental states that will destroy them, will cause them to weaken or be eliminated. So the first two verses pertaining to this karma is definite. Furthermore, for example, when one sows in a fertile field, going back to my analogy of the field or the garden that we're growing, seeds such as wheat or barley, peas, rice, or millet, shoots of the appropriate type come up without confusion. In the same way, from karma in general come pleasure and suffering in general. Pleasure and suffering, respectively, down to the smallest, arise from virtue and non-virtue, never confounded. From no cause or discordant cause, they cannot arise. So this is the idea that, again, it's definite or certain. And we have this confidence then that this is how it works, that if you plant a positive action, you're going to get a happiness result from that. Again, provided that it comes through with its full fruition and what have you. It isn't harmed in the process, but that's the nature of it. A virtuous action brings about happiness. On the other side, something that is non-virtuous, that is unskillful, that harms others and ourselves, creates suffering. It's never confounded. It's never like, okay, I did something positive, but I'm getting a horrible suffering result. Now, in the moment, I mean, this is the thing we have to keep in mind, is that karma takes time to ripen generally. They do say some karmas can ripen within this life, especially those that are more powerful. But a lot of karma takes well beyond, certainly the next moment or day or two to ripen. You know, uh, a lot of people have this idea that I did something really positive and then the person treated me like garbage. Maybe you gave some money to somebody. This does happen sometimes with people who are unhoused, that need some resources and they ask for something and maybe you give them what you can and they look at it and they go, "Why even bother? What did you give me this for? I need more money than that." And so you might think, "Oh, well, I did this wonderful virtuous act of being kind to somebody and giving them money, but all I got back was verbal abuse." Well, the verbal abuse is a result of some other karma, a negative karma. That's why it's a form of suffering. You cannot get the result of verbal abuse from doing a good act. The good act you did will have its own result in the future, and it'll be a happiness result. So everything is definite, it's certain, just like when you plant, as it said in there, particular grains, well, then you get that grain. You don't plant wheat and then get rice, and you don't plant zucchini and get eggplant. It just doesn't happen, right? This is, again, just mirroring in our world of physical cause and effect, the exact same thing that we see, that things are definite in terms of what arises. Okay, then we have the next section, verses 257, just 257, sorry. Just as a small seed grows into a big fruit, so too from tiny causal virtues and sins, boundless resultant pleasures and sufferings arise, such as pleasure and suffering for numberless lives. I don't like this word sins. I mean, sin is a carryover from, again, this whole translation is a bit antiquated in parts, but nonetheless, the point here is this idea of karma increasing. And I've had the question from people, well, why does it increase? It's just in its nature. But if we look at in the example with physical causes, let's use an apple seed. Yeah, we know an apple seed is pretty tiny, right? You can plant that apple seed in the ground, provided that it germinates and everything starts happening after that. You can get bushels and bushels of apples year after year from that apple tree, right? It's just a little seed like this. Of course, yes, it does require some other things feeding into it. The carbon dioxide in the environment, you've got the sunshine, you've got the nutrients in the soil, you have water, you have many different things that contribute to that happening. Karma, by its very nature, just as soon as we plant that seed, will grow exponentially, they say, day by day by day, to create amazing, pleasurable results over time from even the smallest of actions and creating unbelievable suffering results from the smallest of actions that are non-virtuous. So this is something to be wary of in regard to making sure we don't plant even the smallest non-virtues, or if we do them, again, we purify, which we will talk about later tonight or next week if we don't get to it. But so the idea here is that this is a natural way that karma works. So on the positive side, we can rejoice, right? Because even the smallest thing, giving 25 cents to, a homeless person, somebody who might benefit from just having, what change was in your pocket. You do that with especially a very good motivation, a motivation of bodhicitta, wanting to benefit all beings. If that's all you have is your 25 cents and you give it to them, you can be creating the causes for billions of dollars in another lifetime. Not that you want to have that for the sake of your own, welfare, but because we can benefit more beings with more money, right? That's the wonderful thing about having resources. They are a conduit for us to be able to accumulate more virtue by being generous with them, by thinking of others as we use them. So this is the idea. Huge results from even the smallest of actions because karma increases. So again, these last two are kind of corollaries. If you don't do the action, guess what? You don't get the result. If you do the action, the result is inevitable. It will happen at some point. Again, as long as there's not something to interrupt the force of that action, that seed having been planted. So let's go on then to verse 258, which is the first of these two, the third general characteristic. If the seed is not sown, no fruit can grow, right? Like if you don't put seeds out in your vegetable garden or whatever, flower garden, even whatever it is you want to grow, you don't get them. It just doesn't happen when you don't plant the seed. Likewise, if the good or bad action is not accumulated, no happy or painful result whatever can happen, for there's no meeting with uncreated karma. Of course, one of the things we see as kind of an offshoot of this is that this means then that anything we do experience is a karma we created, because you cannot experience the result without having created the karma, the cause. So that's another way, again, of reaffirming our ownership of what it is that we experience, which one of the main things that the teachings on karma are to help us to do is to lessen the tendency to blame other people. This is a big thing in our culture, right? We blame everyone else for causing our misery and our pain. I'm not saying they aren't involved. They did do something that was perhaps a bit careless and maybe even intentionally harmful towards us. I'm not denying that they did those things, but we put all the blame 100% on them. Well, if they weren't such an awful, horrible person, then I would be fine. If I could just get them off, vote them off the island, I'd be okay. But that's not how karma is working at all. They are certainly creating that action themselves of being cruel or difficult with you. But why with you? Why is it yours? Why are you having that experience? Because you created the cause. So it takes that blame thing out of the picture because it's a co-created thing. Rinpoche, Lama Zopa Rinpoche would often say that this is something we did create in the past with that person, which is kind of mind-blowing that sometime in the past we had this experience with somebody and we've created this karma that in this life we have this interaction with them that's very beneficial or very harmful. That's your karma. You created it. And of course, once more, we look at it through the lens of, what is that teaching me? Teaching me to stop creating the causes for that. Treat this person differently. Don't get upset and angry and mad at them because they're being abusive to you. Try to find a way to work with that. You know? So this is the idea again. We cannot meet with something unless we've created the causes. So if you are meeting with it, guess what? You created the causes. It's yours. That's your karmic result. Then verses 259 and 260, which are the last of these four general characteristics. Again, this sort of corollary to what we just saw. If a seed is sown, however, without obstructing conditions, without, again, interferences, its fruit will undoubtedly grow. In just this way, if a virtue is accumulated and not destroyed by some destructive condition, such as anger, anger is often pointed out as one of the most harmful things to our virtue that we've accumulated. It can weaken it or destroy it. But also the mind of wrong view, especially the wrong view that holds to the negation of karma, that karma doesn't exist. Well, that obviously becomes a carte blanche for us to do whatever we want because we think there are no consequences of our actions. So wrong view or anger, some of these very heavy negative states of mind can destroy your virtue. But if your virtue isn't destroyed, it will eventually come, bring about its happiness. As it says in first line of 260, its result, happiness, must unavoidably come. Whether you want that happiness or not, if you engage in a virtuous action and it's left unharmed, it's going to produce happiness in the future. Likewise, if a created non-virtues not purified by purifying conditions, such as confession, its result, suffering, must unavoidably come. Again, this term confession, we do use the term confession at times in Buddhism, but it's a purification practice where you are looking at your stuff. And again, I'll talk about that a little later, where we go through the four opponent powers that help us to purify our negative karma. So these are the four things that are guiding our karma, the four general characteristics. You're going to get a definite result from the type of karma you create. It's going to increase, which I might point out, this is contrary to what a lot of conventional wisdom says around karma, right? They think that there's like a tit for tat. Okay, you see somebody who was just yelling at somebody, and then a couple of days later you see them getting yelled at, and you think, oh, they got their karma, right? Well, first of all, karma is on both sides of the equation, good or bad, but that's not how karma works. It's not, okay, I was yelled at here. Now, 3 lifetimes down the road, I'm going to get yelled at. It's much bigger because it increases. Karma increases, so you get much huger results out of the small actions you've created or any action you've created than what it was originally. Number 3, if you didn't create the causes, can't get the result. If you do create the causes, you will get the result. That's number 4. Like I said, there's a lot in those, a lot to think about. I would encourage you to do a meditation on that, this coming week, to really look through those and see how there is some sense to them. Another thing I do when I teach on karma is I say, well, essentially, this is the Buddha's explanation, according to the Buddha's wisdom, of why things happen. All spiritual traditions talk about this to some degree, right? In the creator theistic kind of traditions, it's because of the will of God, right? Why did Job have to go through all this stuff in the Bible or whatever? It's the will of God. Some people look at it and they don't subscribe to any religion, and they might think it's all random, right? Oh, just everything's random. I mean, one day I can run into beautiful, wonderful experiences, the next day into horrible, crappy experiences. It's just random. It's just the way things happen. There's no rhyme or reason. I think the teachings on karma make a lot more sense than some compassionate, merciful God who's like punishing or rewarding you willy-nilly, seemingly. I don't know. I mean, that's my perception. Or everything happening randomly, or these other theories that are out there about why things happen. This is an actual cause and effect. This is something, again, that the Buddha explains from his wisdom. It's not something I can prove to you. I can't say, oh, Colleen, that money you got from somebody, that's due to act of generosity from 2 lifetimes ago when you did this and that. A Buddha could do that because a Buddha has that omniscient mind that knows all of that, the sources of various results down to the individual thing that happened. But, I can't prove that to you. The Buddha gave general teachings on how karma works, and that's what we study when we look at this topic. But we can't really know the intricacies of this. Very difficult for us to get our heads around because it does require some level of faith. But the faith should be based on the fact that what else the Buddha taught, we can reason through and we can come to see the validity of it, right? And that's what we're going to get into more and more as we, go to the teachings on emptiness and all this. We can examine these teachings and we can see that they are true. Well, why would the Buddha give us, this false teaching about karma? And actually, it can be very empowering if we live our lives from this perspective. Venerable Rabina often talks about how the teachings on karma aren't something we should believe or not believe anyway. That's not the right approach. She uses the concept of it being like a working hypothesis. I think I even talked about this in the course we did last year on the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, because it's all about karma, right? About all the various actions we do and how we experience the Wheel of Sharp Weapons coming back to us on the basis of the things that we've done in the past. Well, she says this is a working hypothesis, so we should actually live our lives according to this principle and see what results happen. I mean, we won't get, again, immediate effects. Don't expect like, oh, I've been practicing paying attention to my karma for a day and the next day isn't any better. Well, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking long term, being dedicated to living our lives this way. But I think we'll be happier people if we stop harming others and stop harming ourselves as well, right? I mean, we should just see a natural kind of ease that we have with our lives when we stop killing all the little bugs and rats and mice and everything else, and we let them live their lives and don't, inflict pain and suffering on them. Or when we stop lying to people or being, dividing others with our speech and saying negative things about people all around. These are the sorts of things, again, that we need to avoid. And we'll be much happier people, and I think we'll get better results in terms of what we see in our lives. I'm going to finish off this section. There's only a few more verses left, and then I'm going to talk about a few more topics in regard to karma. So, verse 261, therefore, since karma is specifically certain, increases, is not met if not created, and once created is inevitable, again, the 4 characteristics, I must devote myself only to virtuous actions because I want to only experience happiness. Assiduous in these from the smallest upwards, insatiable like a greedy man gathering wealth, and trying not to destroy those created with anger, again, or wrong views, other negative states of mind. And I must, so that's like the first affirmation, is that we have to be intent upon engaging in virtue. Then the next part of it, and I must never commit non-virtuous actions, but practice avoiding them from the smallest upwards, fearing them like a poisonous snake in my lap. So this is the idea with regard to non-virtuous. We see it as anathema. We don't want to engage in non-virtue in the least. And we want to do everything we can to strengthen our virtue. Then it says, with the 4 forces, sure to pacify or to purify any committed, especially not satisfied just with high estate, I must practice with effort in all the causes of gaining the excellent body with eightfold karmic fruition, since this is more powerful for realizing enlightenment. So again, we have to dedicate ourselves to purifying all the negativities, and I'll talk about that again when we get to the four opponent powers, but also not be happy with, getting a good rebirth. Try to, do everything that we can to be able to realize enlightenment, which again requires the eightfold karmic fruition. This is what I talked about back in verse 149. I remember I went through the eight, even there was a handout that you all got in regard to that, the eight ripened qualities, they're often called. We want to get a good rebirth as a human, but we want it to also have many other qualities, right? To make sure that we have some power, some status in the world, that we are independent, and so on. Again, I listed those out. We went through those then. But this is the whole purpose of these teachings on karma at this juncture, is to say, okay, we've got this perfect rebirth. We're going to die. We could end up in an unfortunate state. We turn to the three jewels for refuge. And what's the main medicine they give us at this point? The teachings on karma, because that's what will actually help us to address this fundamental problem. That is the first level of the stages of the path. So let me see how far I get with some of these additional topics on karma. And again, I'll allow a little bit of time for some questions just so people can ask what they need to. First, I want to explain something that's called the four branches of a complete action. We often talk about the 10 non-virtuous actions and the 10 virtuous actions, which are their opposites. In regard to the 10 non-virtuous actions, these, I actually should have that labeled that. I'll change that before I send out these slides. These are the four branches of a complete non-virtuous action, because we got a delusion present in number 2 there. The very first one is the basis or the object. And I might point out to you that there is a wonderful little handout that the FPMT has where this information is gone through in regard to all 10 of these. It's called the 10 non-virtues and their results. It's available from the FPMT and you can get it for free. I thought about sending it to Colleen and having her send it out, but I think it's okay for you just to order through the FPMT shop. I'll send the link for this in particular. And if you want to make a donation to FPMT for it, it's quite nice. It's like a very convenient reference in regard to these actions. And of course, the 10 virtues are the opposites of these. So I could have just shared this, I suppose, rather than the slide. It's a little bit easier to look at. We first have the basis or object of the action. This means that there has to be something that we're working with. And often it's a being. In regard to the first of the 10 non-virtues, killing, it is a being. Let's actually go to killing and look at that. The basis is a living being other than yourself. It's always said to be this. It's not that suicide isn't killing yourself. It's just not a complete action of killing. It's obviously said to be generally a non-virtuous action. But nonetheless, it wouldn't be included in this because the basis is always a being that is other than ourselves. The intention, the second part of this, has 3 parts. This is often, I like to refer to this as the state of mind. What is your state of mind? What is going on in your mind? Because that's, again, where karma is created primarily. And then it becomes stronger when we actually kill a being in this case and commit the act of killing. First, there's the recognition. You recognize unmistakably the person or being you intend to kill. So if you think you're going to kill an ant, but it's actually just a piece of dirt on your counter, well, there's no correct recognition then. You think it's an ant, but it's actually just some dirt because you don't have your glasses on or whatever. I don't know. The motive, you have to intend to kill. This means that if we're walking through a field and unaware that there are insects underfoot, well, then we're not intending to kill them, right? We're not like actually taking our foot and smashing an insect with our shoe or something. Delusion, you have to be motivated to kill out of anger, attachment, or ignorance. And we could include other delusions, but those are the 3 poisons, the 3 main ones. And it gives examples. We'll just go through the first one. For example, out of anger, killing an enemy or a being that annoys you. This sometimes happens when you have a mosquito in your room at night, right? And it's bothering you, keeping you awake, and you finally catch it on the wall and you smash it, and might even be happy that you did it. But that's the delusion of kind of anger that could manifest in terms of the annoyance at a mosquito. The third factor, the third branch, is that you have to commit the deed or ask someone else to commit the deed. Maybe you're sleeping in the room and someone else is up and you say, could you kill that mosquito for me? And if they do it for you, you're accumulating the same karma. But it says there you carry out the killing by some means, either directly by yourself or indirectly by ordering someone else to kill. And it's complete. You have the full four factors kind of brought to their fruition when the other person or the being dies before you do. So, as I said earlier, suicide's a negative action that will bring suffering, but is not a complete act of killing because the first one isn't there. It's a being other, it is yourself, and it has to be a being other than yourself. But for the fourth one, you die at the same time that the being that you're killing dies. Now, why is that important? I've never gotten an absolute straight answer on this, but it seems like you have to be there to accumulate the karma of killing. If you're not there because you've taken your own life, well, then you're not there. So the act of killing can't kind of be complete. Kind of makes sense in that regard. But all of these other non-virtues have similar four branches, four things. They have a basis, they have a state of mind or intention, they have a deed, and then they have a completion. When all four are there, then you have a very powerful karma. You have a karma that actually can bring about a rebirth in another realm. That's why, again, at this stage of the teachings, it's taught very in detail how to how these particular actions are engaged in, the 10 non-virtues, and then how we can avoid them. Certainly avoid them becoming complete, but try to avoid them at all, so we aren't engaging in you know any types of actions of harming others. Let's go through the 10 non-virtues so you know what they are. And again, they're all in that booklet with the various things, and they're in most Lam texts with similar explanations. We have the three actions of body. And by the way, of the three doors, as they're called, body, speech, and mind, body is said to be the most powerful because we can do things with our body that, again, take the lives of others, killing, that take their property without being offered it and stealing. And then what I like to refer to as inappropriate sexual behavior, which is primarily adultery, or coercive sexual behavior where someone is having non-consensual sexual activity with you. Any of those are the kind of ways that we can harm others through our body. And in general, killing is more serious than stealing than inappropriate sexual behavior. But obviously, it depends upon the individual act and what's involved and the level of harm, so many other factors that I won't go into tonight. The four actions of speech are not as powerful as the three actions of body, but they still can cause an awful lot of harm. And they are also set out in descending order in terms of the worst is said to be lying. We live in a culture of a lot of disinformation, right? And lying to others, giving them misinformation, and not having them have access to the truth is very painful and causes a lot of problems. Deceiving others with our speech. The fifth one, dividing others through our speech. This is where people are already divided and we create a further division, or where there was no division and we use our speech and say things about one person or the other to divide those people. Six is harsh speech, where we use our speech to cut others, cause pain through saying very negative, hateful things towards them. Meaningless speech is the least offensive of these, the least powerful of these, but it means engaging in speech that doesn't serve a particular purpose. It just is, as Venerable Rabina would say, rabbiting on. I don't know this term from my growing up, but apparently in Australia they use this a lot, just to rabbit on about something. I guess the idea is the way rabbits just kind of bounce all over the place, I guess. I don't know. So these four, again, are less offensive and less powerful than those of body in general, but we can do a lot of harm through these, especially the first three. Meaningless speech is maybe not as harmful, but we can waste a lot of other people's time by just talking about unimportant things. The last three are set out in the opposite order. Actions that are only of mind are not as powerful because we don't actually harm others at that level, though they are the pathway through which we often do engage in the actions of body or speech. The first one is covetousness, and that's the least of these three. Actually, it's opposite order. Covetousness means to wish to acquire the possessions that others have. Ill will or malice is where we have a harmful intent towards others. And then wrong view, this came up earlier tonight, that's how we can destroy some of our positive karma. Wrong view means holding to that things that the Buddha taught to exist don't exist. These three, again, can often become the doorway through which we engage in other negative actions. Like covetousness, you might, see that somebody's got a beautiful garden, next door to you, and they have these amazing flowers. Maybe they have these huge dahlias or something, beautiful flowers, and you go over there, and when they're gone, you snip a few for yourself, right? Covetousness starts when, you every time you walk by, you go, wow, those flowers are beautiful. They look so good in my home on my kitchen table. And then you eventually want to acquire them so much that you engage in the act of stealing. I might mention, though, that covetousness is wishing to acquire anything that belongs to someone else, even goods that are sold in stores or on the internet, because those are possessions others have. And we develop this very acquisitional mind, wishing to acquire things constantly. So it's a very powerful force in our world. And a lot of things that we acquire honestly, right? We, through our hard-earned money, we pay for things and we enjoy them ourselves and don't, no one else is harmed by it. But this is, again, this is the weakest of all 10 of these, but it's something that we do quite frequently with objects of desire. We do need some things to survive, food, clothing, what have you. But we can see when our minds get kind of twisted around desire and we're wishing to accumulate things or whatever the case might be. So those 10 are described in much more detail in that little handout. Again, I'll send Colleen the link. Um, I may want to stop here just to give time for questions, but let me look at what the next one is. Um, yeah, let me very briefly talk about when we do have a complete action. We get 4 results out of it. The very first one is the actual rebirth. It ripens into what is called a fruitional result, the actual rebirth you take. And for any of the non-virtues, it will be a rebirth in the lower realms, depending upon various other factors. The next 2 are results similar to the cause, meaning they have a flavor that's like the action we did. And that's in terms of experience. So like if you engage in doing a lot of stealing, well, then your possessions will be stolen or not be of good quality or deteriorate or whatever. That's the experience. It's similar to what you did of damaging others' resources. Now yours are damaged. And then, of course, results similar to the cause in terms of behavior means that you have a tendency to steal in the future. That's what one of the worst results of karma is, that we actually continue to do the same things. Environmental result refers to the fact that we actually do have some effect on the environment that we live in by virtue of the actions we engage in. I might point it out. These are also in this booklet. Um, let's go to killing right here. The environmental result is taking birth in a place where there's much violence, war, many problems, where food and drink and medicine have little power, and so on. Okay. So again, these are explained in the booklet. I won't talk much more about them. But when you have a complete action, you've created the potential for all 4 of those results. So you might be freaking out now thinking, oh my God, what have I done? And we'll get to that. Sorry that it's a week away, but many of you already know these 4 opponent powers. They are the way to purify all of our non-virtue. And then, of course, we want to, as much as possible, engage in the opposite of these 10 non-virtues, changing our behavior. So we stop killing the little critters and we stop stealing from others and lying to them and saying harmful things to them, and stop all of our crazy mind states that are behind all of this. So any questions on karma or refuge that we talked about tonight? I know it's like a lot of information, but I frankly was a bit surprised that there weren't more verses in this section on karma, because it's a huge, huge topic. Anyone? Yeah, please, Ruth.
Um, what role does your perception play with karma? I mean, how you interpret, what's happening to you.
Mm-hmm. It's playing a big role, obviously. I mean, if we look at it from the point of view of what is the result we experience from a particular karma, like that first thing that it's definite, we're talking about essentially a feeling of happiness from virtue and a feeling of suffering from non-virtue. That's really the full result. When we talk about the experiences of happiness and suffering, that's what we mean, is a feeling tone, this mental factor of feeling. It's talked about frequently in Buddhism. It just means a sensation, something that we are experiencing. To have painful words from somebody is a product of our non-virtue, that when we hear those words, through our hearing, and then of course there's a perception to some degree of those as painful, but we can change obviously our perception of certain things. That's the whole point of all of Buddhism, right? Is to change our perception so that we're not continually following our habitual patterns. Our habitual pattern is when somebody yells something at us that's very harmful or derogatory, is that we immediately have the mind of anger arising, right? We hear those painful words, that's a sensation that it's suffering, but then we add a mental overlay on top of that. And we think horrible things about that person. We think that that person, needs to be put in their place or whatever. And maybe we yell back at them, or maybe if we like go over and actually, start using our fists or whatever to do damage to them or to their possessions or whatever. So our perception is everything that follows, is the way I'm seeing it from your question. Our perception of things follows on the basis of either our habit, if we're inclined to do things in that more familiar way, or the Dharma, where we learn to do things in a different way, where we learn to work with whatever it is that we're experiencing in a very kind of completely opposite way. And that happens with both pleasant and unpleasant or suffering feelings and experiences. Because the pleasant experiences, we also have a tendency to get very attached to those, right? And we don't want them to stop, and we want to grasp at them and keep, experiencing them. But you can still just be with that blissful experience without any of that attachment. And attachment is a perception. And just like anger is a perception, all of these are mental constructs. They are a thought process that we go through on the basis of those feelings. So when we experience something that is harmful, and you might practice with this over the next week, when somebody says or does something, or you hear words from a politician that you don't like or whatever, and you have that immediate reaction of the pain that you experience from hearing that, just see if you can change your perception of it, to not see it through the lens of something that will lead to more anger and thoughts that are just going to compound your karma, keep creating the same thing over and over again. Why do people do things that are harmful to us? Because we create the causes for that harm. Well, then we have to change our perception. We have to actually look at things as opportunities. That's why in the Bodhisattva teachings, you get all these, like working with difficulties and problems. This is what we looked at to some degree in the last course that we did on the Wheel of Sharp Weapons. When we have negativities coming up, these unfavorable experiences, we can choose to perceive them as even just what I said earlier, something we can learn from, something we can go, oh, wow, how did I create that? That's an interesting one. Somebody's saying that about me. I wonder how I created that. I wonder what I need to be attentive to. I wonder what I need to purify. Become more inquisitive about it and look at it in a very different way as a lesson rather than, some painful experience that requires us to take action and put that person in their place. So if that's how you're interpreting perception, I mean, that's how I interpret it. It all has to do with, again, how are we going to look at what we're experiencing? We don't have much control over what we experience at this juncture, right? Because it's the product of stuff we've done through our crazy minds, through our three poisons, through all the delusions we have. Those seeds are planted and they're going to ripen eventually because of these principles we looked at tonight, these characteristics. What we do have control over to some degree, once we decide we're going to, again, be better drivers in the driver's seat, is how we react, or I like to use the word respond rather than react. React, if we think about the word, it's reacting, reacting. I keep reacting, acting the same way again and again and again. Whereas responding is being responsible. I'm going to take responsibility for having created that, and I'm going to be more responsible in how I respond to it, how I actually work with it. But it requires a change in our perception, obviously, because this is not the normal way we perceive things. And it's not the way the world perceives things. When someone harms them, they perceive it as unjustifiable and blame that person and want to retaliate. And that's why we have wars. That's why we have all the conflict in our world. So we have to perceive it differently. Oh, this is my karmic creation. This is the seed I planted. What can I learn from that? How can I behave differently so I don't keep stepping in it again and again? Does that make some sense? Is that what you were kind of asking about, Ruth?
Yeah, I'm just trying to sort of sort it all out,
Uh,
because to me it's very complicated. Um, and how, all this sort of fits together and how
mhm.
it works and, what is a good source, a good way for me to, start to work with it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's very complicated, but it's also somewhat simple when it comes down to it. I don't want to overcomplicate it because it essentially is those four characteristics give us everything we need to know, and it's not that much. But it's just following this idea of like I'm going to keep as much as possible this fundamental principle, which is stop harming others and stop harming ourselves. Just stop doing things that cause us to be crazier and stop doing things that cause others to experience pain. That's the fundamental principle behind, all of our Buddhist philosophy, because we are the creators of our own experiences. And so if we have more beneficial minds, happier minds, compassionate minds, loving minds, and actions that follow from those, well, then we're going to be happier people and have happier experiences. And everyone else around us is going to be happier too, because we're going to stop killing all the little critters that, invade our house. And we're going to stop doing all the things that, we habitually do towards others that cause them pain and difficulty. So it's very simple in its nature. The complexities come in when you do start looking at all these various details and, the 10 this and the 10 that and the 4 this and the 4 that and what have you. But um, I think, there was what Jiminy Cricket said, let your conscience be your guide. I think at some level we do have an inner compass that's our conscience that we can follow to some degree. Once we clear out some of the garbage, we recognize things as being very selfish or motivated by um, concerns that are not, more universal and are very much, directed by our own needs. And we just look at how to be in the world. Of course, as we go through the teachings, and of course, many of you have gone through the Lamrim a number of times, but you see that the later teachings do help inform the whole principle of karma. The idea of interdependence, that everything is, we're living in a world of interdependence. Well, then why would I want to harm others when I depend upon them? Why would I want to harm any being? Because they are a part of the world that I live in. Kind of, get these bigger views of things rather than this very narrow range of stuff where it's just about me, and what I want and what I need and what have you. So there's a lot of teachings that inform it over, the course of the Lam Rim. But at this level, it's really just, it is a bit of self-concern. I don't want to suffer in the future. But you can also start to add in that other element. And I shouldn't want others to suffer either. And that's the fundamental principle of everything the Buddha taught. There's that wonderful little prayer. We'll see if there are other questions. I'm sorry, I'm going a little over, but where we say, do not commit any non-virtuous actions, commit or perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. The subduing your mind comes over time. That's the harder part. But stop doing all the negative stuff. Stop doing the harmful stuff. Start engaging in the more positive things, being kind, generous, compassionate, caring, concerned, and work on subduing our minds, taming our minds. Simplifies the Buddha's teachings into three main practices that are the essence of everything he taught. So I agree with you. It's complicated at some level, but it's also a very simple way to live one's life, just to say, okay, and be that kind of voice asking yourself, am I harming others right now by what I am doing? Before you say it, before you do it, before you even think it, is that beneficial? Is that something that will actually help? Or is that something that's going to cause pain or harm? Thank you for that question. Yeah. Anything else or any other comments, Ruth? It's a lot to think about with regard to karma. Again, any good long run text, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, they have a huge section on karma. If you can, try to go through that the next week. When I return next week, next Tuesday, we will go through the four opponent powers so you have a tool to use to clean up all the negative stuff. Those of you who already are doing that practice, please keep it up because it's important. So, okay, then let's do our prayers to conclude things for tonight. Um, we're going to do the first dedication prayer again, dedicating all this merit with the best possible result in mind. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then wishing for bodhicitta, this most powerful motivation to continue to grow and develop in our own hearts and in the hearts of all beings. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then we'll do the long life prayer for His Holiness, thinking that this is also making the prayer for all the wishes to be fulfilled, as well as the good health and the long lives of all of our gurus. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Since we've gone a bit over, we won't recite the full prayer for Rinpoche, but just make strong dedication for Rinpoche's very swift return so that we and others in this world can benefit from his presence again. And lastly, dedicate for all the beings you're holding in your hearts. There might be beings in parts of the world where there's great suffering, war, strife, poverty, famine, what have you. And it can be also the beings that we know that are in our families, our circle of friends who we care about, and send this positive energy out to them so it becomes a cause for relieving their suffering immediately and helping them to have all the causes leading up to perfect happiness. And may this be so for all beings through what we have done here together tonight. Great. Thank you all for allowing me to go blah, blah, blah about this wonderful text. And again, if you can use the verses to meditate on at least those 4 general characteristics of karma, be very beneficial. So thank you, Colleen, for all your support. Everyone
Thanks,
else
Dan.
involved with
Thank
the
you so
center
much.
there. Okay, I'll look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a good one.
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks, Dan.
all right, bye.